Welcome to ABL, Down on the Farm. Our motto is ABP, always be prospecting. We focus on prospect analysis. Get ready to win your Dynasty League.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to ABL Down on the Farm, episode 58, where we talk all things fantasy baseball prospecting, but especially prospecting in the ABL, a 30-team Dynasty League with 20 spots per team for minor leaguers for a glorious 600 prospects. And on today's show, I want to talk about a handful of very well-known prospects. They're on a bunch of top 100 lists or right around there. And I also want to mine for some gold, some guys to consider whether you should add or not add based on their performance, who are basically not on any lists. So they're for really deep league prospectors. So we'll talk about those two sets of players. But without further ado, I'll jump into the first set that I want to highlight for today's show. And the first is Edward Florentino, the Pirates center fielder, right fielder. A little unclear where he's going to stick defensively. He's still playing some center field. He's owned by the ABL Marlins, plays for the Pirates. 19 years old, 9 months. He's at high A ball, so pretty good age for level. He's young for the level. 6'3", 200 pounds, really strong power frame. He's a prospect that really came on last year, broke out, jumped up a lot of prospect lists. And one of the reasons I wanted to check in on him now is because I just read a recent scouting report from Baseball HQ that threw a little water on his profile. And so I wanted to talk about a little bit of that and how I assess Florentino based on that one look. It was over 3 games that the scout took a look at him, and how much to factor that in or not factor it in as we're moving forward and considering Florentino's future and his present value. So you can see his stat line at high A ball. It's not very impressive. In fact, it's quite alarming. He's slashing 217, 330, 448 over 342 plate appearances. And he still has a solid but not great weighted on base average. He's hitting home runs. He's got 17 home runs, but not a lot of extra base hits to go along with it. So a lot of singles or home runs. And he's striking out a ton at 28.7%, still walking at a fairly good clip at 13.5%. So let's talk about how I'm looking at him, again, through the lens of the scouting report I just looked at on Baseball HQ. So let's talk about that. The scouting report confirms that he has great bat speed, double plus bat speed, and has legit power. So those things remain unquestioned. But what we saw last year was Florentino's hit tool get really well rated, and this scouting report casts some doubt on that. So I want to talk about what I gleaned from the scouting report. You can see at a top level, Baseball HQ dropped him to an 8C, which is an above average regular, but with a ceiling risk of a C medium, which suggests that he might just project as an average regular, but has a ceiling of an above average regular. And let's talk about why they dropped that grade down from the higher grade entering into the preseason. He's got a hitch in his swing, and I note that is something that can be corrected and adjusted if he has good coaching at the minor league level. And he has inconsistent swing planes. Again, something that can be worked on with good coaching. He's still very young, and he's being challenged by older competition at high A ball. So while the scouting report gave him some demerits on these fronts, I would just note that these things are correctable, so I'm not overly alarmed. I would want to see progress and adaptation from the player as he moves forward, but I'm not ready to bail ship based on those two things in and of themselves. This other thing caught my attention, that the walk rate of 13.5% was more a product of being tentative than being selective. In other words, he was not very confident at the plate, and he has a lot of swing and miss issues inside the strike zone. So those are things that can also be corrected, but they do raise some questions about his hit tool. It could just be a fact that he's playing against older competition and trying to catch up. Feels a little bit overmatched, and maybe he is based on the slash line. So we really want to see how this progresses going into next year. He probably will end up starting at high A ball again, and then hopefully get advanced to double A. And the real question I have on the bottom of the screen are these the product of being young for the level? Or is it a hint that his hit tool is going to be really exposed at double A? I think Florentino's a guy that you'd be selling low on right now if you tried to deal him. There's still probably some prospect buzz interest in Florentino. Unfortunately, at this point in the season, if you haven't already dealt them, you're kind of stuck with them, I think, going into next year, because you're just not going to get good value for him in all likelihood. If you do get a good offer, it might be worthwhile pulling the trigger on it, because you could actually, sell off a guy before he gets exposed to AA potentially, and get good value for him in that hypothetical. I just think that's probably unlikely at this point in the year, and also going into next season with these kind of like paltry numbers that he's put up. But I'm not out on Florentino. I think he has the chance to kind of adapt and mature as a hitter, and it's really hard to give up on that legitimate power at such a young age, particularly with his bat speed. So kind of a mixed bag this year for Florentino. I thought it was worth highlighting given the scouting report. I did a similar thing with Justin Gonzalez earlier this year, and that scouting report, if you recall, was a little bit more pessimistic than Florentino's. But I thought that was an interesting guy to highlight, given his struggles this year. So let's talk about the next guy, Wandy Asigen, the Mets shortstop who's down to the DSL. He's a guy I've highlighted before this year on the show. During my DSL preview, I spent a fair amount of time on Wandy. Asigen is very young for the level still. He's only 16 and 11 months. So he was about 16, 7 months when the season began. 6 feet, 180, really good hitter frame. Has potential to put on some weight. That listed weight is probably a little light for him at this point. But that was the weight that was listed going into the season. He projects to have power. You can see his, Baseball America grades there: 45 hit tool, 55 power, 60 run. So the question really was, going into the season, was he going to hit enough to really make his power mean anything? Another thing with Wandy is he's been really limited by injuries this year, which is always a threat at the DSL that it's going to stunt his development. He only has 83 plate appearances, 413 weighted on base average, which is very solid. You can see his slash line, which is very good. So he's done pretty well against older competition. His stolen bases, I'm sorry, he's got a lot of extra bases, 17 out of his 17 hits are for extra bases. So, he's reaching into in-game power, which is impressive. And that 55 power tool is probably going to stick going into next year. I'm interested to see what happens with the run tool, whether that comes down a little bit. Always interesting to see as the player puts on more weight and gets a little bit more filled out as they get older. The run tool can come down, but it probably will stay at 60 going into next year when he comes stateside and goes to presumably the CPX. But the hit tool, let's talk about that. You can see he has got a 22.9% walk rate, which is very impressive, but it's coupled with a 28.9% K rate, which is pretty alarming at the DSL for a hitter. Again, it's only 83 plate appearances, so we're still dealing with a relatively small sample size with Wandy, but it does raise some concerns about whether that hit tool will ever get to a 50. We like the walks, we like a high on base average, but the strikeouts are our concern. So we'll want to see how it plays out in the CPX with Wandy. I think it's enough of a red flag where you're a little bit concerned if you're a guy, but you're going to hold on to him because you've already paid presumably a really high acquisition value to get Wandy in the draft. He was a very highly regarded DSL prospect, so most people spent either a first or second round draft pick on him. But a relatively good start for Wandy. Fairly optimistic about him. I just still have questions about that hit tool and whether they're going to really, whether he is going to be really able to elevate it above a 50 to make him a top tier guy. You can see his overall grade is a 55 in Baseball America, which again is above average. But when you compare him to other guys like Angel Gomez, in the same draft class, same signing class, who in many cases got drafted after Wandy Asigen. That Gomez is surpassed Wandy very easily this year in terms of overall value in fantasy. He's a prospect that has a 60 grade in Baseball America. I talked about him, on the last show as well. I've talked about him a couple times this year. But again, Wandy's got an interesting future. Still a highly regarded prospect. I thought it was worthwhile just checking in on him to see how he was doing, particularly given his limited playing time. It's been difficult to highlight him earlier in the season until now. So let's talk about another Mets shortstop from the preceding DSL class, Elian Pena, who I talked about earlier this year as getting a very aggressive assignment, basically going to A-ball this year as an 18-year-old. He's 18 and 9 months now, so very young for the level. 5'10", 180. It's a smaller frame, so there's always going to be some questions about his power, right? And how is it playing out in the real world? And how has he handled the older competition? Generally speaking, he's done all right. Okay, he's got a 13.7 walk rate, 20.9 K rate, so he has not been overmatched. You like that walk rate. It's not striking out at an alarming rate. But this is a guy who, there are questions about his power based on his frame. And if you look at the BA grades that he had coming into the season, 45 hit, 55 power, 40 run, 55 overall. So I want to talk about each one of those grades and what I'm seeing in the stats and his performance so far and where he may net out going into next year. He's got over 358 plate appearances, which is a good sample size. He's got a 299 weighted on base average, all right, which is not great. Okay, and one of the reasons it's not great is he's just not hitting for extra base power. He's not hitting for home run power. He's not getting a lot of doubles. Some of that is because he's very young for the level. Okay, and that is not unusual, but it does raise some concerns when a weighted on base average is that low about whether he's really a 55 power guy. And I would also point out that he's got a 405 slugging percentage, another little red flag on his power. Not ready to write off his power based on that sample size, but it's not nothing. His slash line is otherwise okay. He's got a 392 on base average. That's driven largely by the walks, of course, which is good, but not great, particularly at the level he's at. But again, perfectly fine for an 18-year-old, almost 19 years old at A ball. This was, again, a very aggressive assignment by the Mets, putting Pena right in there and skipping basically the CPX. So, the other thing I would say is he's gotten 28 stolen bases this year out of 37 attempts, which is slightly below the 80% benchmark you want to see. The reason I highlight that is to illustrate the 40 run tool and where this may, net out as we go into next year. He's run a little bit better than I think, scouts thought he was going to perform at. And so that run grade may come up a little bit. And where do I see him potentially netting out as the scouting reports evolve going into next year? I mean, could we see a 50 hit tool, 50 power, 45 run, maybe 50 run, 50, 55 overall? I could see that kind of adjustment for Pena going in, which still makes him a nice prospect. But when you take that power grade down, if it does come down, it makes him a little less interesting. And the real question is going to be whether his glove will get him enough time in that scenario to really be an effective accumulator of statistics at a major league level. Really too early to write Pena off in any way. Obviously, the Mets organization felt very confident about him in assigning him to A ball and skipping the complex league. But the verdict is still out on Pena, and we'll see how it progresses, as he moves into next year, into 2027, and maybe gets up to high A ball. If he might start in A ball at the beginning of the season and they get elevated pretty quickly to high A ball, which would not be an unusual move, and again would make him extraordinarily young for the level, which is something that we like to see. All right, so I wanted to transition away from these more established prospects into what I would call like mining for gold in a very deep league like ABL and some of the other leagues that I'm in. These are guys that are largely unowned. I'm going to highlight 3 players, 2 of which are free agents in the ABL, one of which is owned by the ABL Rockies. So let's dive right into it, and I'll explain kind of what my thinking is on these 3 different players. The first is Victor Duarte, who's a Braves pitching prospect. He's basically a left-handed power pitcher. He's a free agent in the ABL, 18 and a half years old. He's at the CPX. He's only pitched 21 innings. He was at the DSL previously, barely pitched there. Came stateside. So interesting that the Braves chose not to have him repeat the DSL, but brought him stateside. He only pitched, I think, like 2.1 innings in the DSL last year. He's got a 45% ground ball rate, which is something you like to see with a young pitcher. He's not going to be as prone to home runs because he's keeping the ball on the ground, and he's going to create more double plays, which you like to see, particularly if you have a good defense behind you. Way too early to say what defense he would have behind him in the major leagues. This kid's way off for the majors. We're probably talking about like 5 years until his debut. But what caught my eye about him is he has a 36% K rate over these 21 innings. Still a small sample size, but that is a really, attractive K rate. It is coupled with a really horrendous walk rate of 16%, which nets out to a 20% K minus walk, which you like to see. And what's interesting about Duarte to me is that he's in the Braves organization. This is an organization that's done an extraordinarily good job of developing pitchers, adjusting their delivery, adjusting their placement on the mound, fiddling with their pitch grips to get the most out of them. And they've had a really high success rate in doing this over time. And if he's a guy who can make some adjustments, harness some command, he becomes a very interesting starting pitching prospect or a potential high leverage relief pitcher. Since he's left-handed, probably would not be a closer, but could be a really valuable setup guy. But if he projects as a starter, this guy has the upside of a 3. There are some concerns about him because he's 6 feet 180, slightly smaller frame. 6 feet is basically the cutoff that I use. Really don't like having pitchers under 6 feet. Really prefer them to be 6'1", 6'2", or taller. But let's talk about his pitch mix a little bit. There are some stats available, some metrics available for him at the CPX, but they're hard to get in a reliable fashion. I was able to track down some stuff about him. There's very little scouting information in basically industry trades. He's got a fastball that sits in the low 90s. He has touched 95. For his age, 18 and a half, that's a pretty solid fastball for a left-handed pitcher. As he matures and fills out, that fastball could gain some velocity. The Braves may also do things with his delivery to get a little bit more velo out of him. He couples that with a hard sinker, which also sits in the 90s. So it's basically a variation off his fastball. And he has a bullet slider, which is a hard slider thrown, in the mid 80s, high 80s, which complements his fastball. Can the Braves teach him a changeup to have a slower pitch to really throw off the timing of hitters? We'll see. But Duarte is a guy that, again, he's a free agent in the ABL. I have a few shares of him in a couple of other leagues that I'm in. They're deep. He's a dart throw. He's a lottery ticket. And what you're really betting on are two things with him. One, the Braves organization and the ability to develop pitching. Two is that strikeout rate of 36%. Because if that walk rate just comes down under 10% or even down to 10%, and the strikeout rate is in the high 20s, low 30s, that's a very interesting prospect. So if he costs you $1 and you have an extra room right now on your roster for a minor leaguer, this is a guy who's an interesting dart throw. I've added him in that scenario when I just had an extra spot. I don't have an extra spot right now in the ABL, but if I did, this is one of the guys I would add pretty promptly. Really interesting guy. Again, power lefty, 6 feet. We'll see where he goes. But I like Duarte a lot. Let's talk about another guy, another pitcher. This is Redona, who is in the Cincinnati Reds organization, another left-hander. He's actually owned by the ABL Rockies and has some very attractive metrics in terms of his performance so far, but I want to dissect that a little bit. He's 18 and 8 months at A-ball. He just got promoted. Most of his season has been at the complex. So he's very young for the level at A, but he basically has no stats there. 5'11", 170, very slight frame. Again, as I highlighted when we were talking about Duarte, I don't like pitchers under 6 feet. So this frame is very unattractive to me. It raises both bullpen risk issues and durability issues when their frames that small. It's not one size fit all. There's always exceptions to the rule. But generally speaking, I want to avoid pitchers that are on the smaller side like Redona is. Now, in 47 innings at the complex, he has been like lights out with his metrics. He also couples it with a 50% ground ball rate. As I was highlighting earlier, that's really good when you can suppress home runs, right? And you're also inducing double plays potentially. So these guys who are not fly ball pitchers, who aren't line drive pitchers, really add value when they can couple it with a K rate. His K rate thus far is very impressive. It's 33.3. And these are all the CPX stats. His walk rate is microscopic at 3.6. This is a really good command pitcher. And he did this at the DSL last year as well. He illustrated phenomenal command. Now, while those numbers are really attractive and those kind of like makes him a ratio darling, there are some flags here. And I want to talk about them in addition to the frame, which I've already highlighted. When I looked at his pitch mix and where they were being graded, there are a couple things that really stood out, both on Fangraphs and in Baseball America, which did a slight blurb on Redona a few weeks ago. He's got a low 90s fastball, which gets some help from his delivery in terms of the angle it comes in on, which creates some difficulty for hitters. He has a slider and he has a changeup, both of which got really tepid reviews as not like being plus pitches, being kind of average at best. That was consistent with the grades and the scouting report on Fangraphs about him. Not particularly exciting. So this is a guy who profiles as a command-first pitcher with substandard stuff. And what I want to talk about is in the context of where he is in his progression. When you're at the CPX, you're facing very immature hitters, generally speaking. And command pitchers oftentimes excel at an alarming rate at the CPX because they're so mature in their pitching approach that they can get guys out by just being really smart pitchers and having the command to get the pitchers where they want them to go. The difficulty as you get more advanced and you move up to A ball, for example, is that the hitters start to catch up and they become more selective. They lay off some of the edge pitches, and they're really able to have fast, good swings that catch up with kind of crappy pitches. And so when you're pitching over the plate with substandard stuff, you really expose yourself, as might happen to Redona now that he's an A ball. So this is a guy who I've had on watch lists, but I've just refused to pick him up because I don't like the height and the frame, and because of the issue I was just highlighting about the CPX advantage that he has being a command pitcher. My fear is that this is a little bit of smoke and mirrors that's going on right now, and he's taking advantage of younger hitters. We'll see how it plays out at A ball. I suspect, but don't know, that he's going to get exposed as he goes between A and high A. So we'll see how he plays out the rest of this year. Next year is going to be a really big test for him because he's going to be facing a class of A ball that includes people who played there all this year and people who have come up from the complex into A ball and are being advanced aggressively by their organizations. And we'll see if he gets bumped up eventually to high A ball. My suspicion is this guy projects as a back of the rotation guy, maybe a long reliever. But it's just, to me, an illustration of how these metrics, while they can be very sexy and interesting, have to be read in context, and you have to understand kind of what the projection is on a prospect like this. So I'm not bullish on him at all, as you can probably tell, but I can see why the superficial stats and the metrics would excite people, and he certainly has great command. We'll see how it all comes together for him. So let's talk about the last guy on the list. And this is an interesting guy to me as well. It's Juan Cepedes. He's in the Los Angeles Angels organization. He's an ABL free agent, 17 years old and 10 months at the DSL. Another small frame guy, 5'10", 170, raises significant concerns about his power projection. And as we're going to see, that's bearing out to be true at the DSL, but there are other things to really like about him potentially. He's got 199 plate appearances, so he's basically been playing all season at the DSL. Super high, 442 weighted on base average. He's got 322, 461, 483 slash line. So you can see the slugging percentage is way down. And so why is his weighted on base average so high? Well, he's got an 18.6 walk rate, which is, really impressive. He also has a 7.5 strikeout rate. All right. So he's putting the ball in play, high contact, high walk guy, and he has a lot of speed. He has 66 stolen bases at the DSL in 73 attempts. You take the stolen bases with a grain of salt when they're playing young catchers and young pitchers who haven't really learned how to hold runners on. But anytime a guy steals 66 bases in a short season in the DSL, you take notice. So this is a guy that I'm watching. I haven't picked him up anywhere, but I'm watching him because I'm very interested to see where the scouting reports come out next year on his fielding. I assume he's going to get picked up in some of the industry trades. Start making lists. And the reason I mention his fielding is if he has a good enough glove to stick at shortstop or second base and actually get playing time, right? He's not going to generate a lot of power, but his profile as an accumulator with that walk rate and the stolen bases makes him an interesting guy. So I'm sitting back and waiting to see what happens with him, but he could end up being a fantasy, monster, particularly in roto leagues, given the stolen bases where they become even more important. But even in a league like ABL, that walk rate would generate a lot of points. The stolen bases would generate a lot of points. Does he become a top of the order regular? If he ends up not really being a great fielder, well, then he becomes a utility infielder or pinch runner, and has a much less interesting profile. But to me, like, his glove is really going to dictate his future. But I thought it was worth highlighting. I don't think he's owned in many leagues, none that I'm involved with. But kind of a total under the radar guy who's putting up like arcade numbers, stolen bases, kind of fun prospect to keep your eyes on. So those are the guys I wanted to highlight today. I wanted to talk about like one other thing that I read that was kind of interesting to me about promotions this time of year, with the lockout looming in 2027. And what I was reading was that the way the rules work, if you promote a guy, you got to put him on your 40-man roster. And as I understand it, if you're on the 40-man roster, you are not eligible to play in the minor leagues next season if there's a lockout. Whereas if you stay down, they can have you in the minors and you can play. Now, assuming that's true, what I read, and that's all correct, it raises an interesting thing for organizations to think about, right? There are prospects right now at AAA who are doing exceedingly well, guys like Charlie Condon and Walker Jenkins, for example. And those organizations have not yet called those dudes up. Could you see a scenario where one of those organizations would want to keep them down to get an extra year of Rule 5 eligibility and also have the ability to like have them play next season in the minor leagues if there's a lockout? It's just something that's interesting to think about, and the extent to which that may be going on in organizations' heads, I don't know. Could be a factor, for example, if you're a contending team versus a team that's out of it. You might have a greater incentive to keep a prospect down if you're a team that's out of it. The old adage was you want to get to see what you have, so you bring these guys up in September. But maybe that adage is thrown out the window with a lockout looming. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out, and maybe give you some insight into the thinking of these organizations in terms of the labor piece or war that's going to happen during the offseason. But again, I can't really speak for these organizations, and I'm assuming what I was reading is accurate, but just kind of an interesting thought piece. In any event, I hope we all enjoy a Sunday of baseball ahead. Thanks for tuning in. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't give, Josh Baez a shout out for hitting 3 home runs yesterday in his major league debut. Very exciting. And we'll see what he and the Cardinals do today. I'll be looking forward to watching it later this afternoon. Well, until then, I'll see you next time. And, I'll leave it to my friends on the outtake to tell you what to do.
Remember to ABP. Always be prospecting.